Coming to you from Perth this afternoon on PM Agenda. Earlier today, I was interviewing Paul Howes here, the exclusive interview in which the, soon-to-be former AWU boss has announced his decision to resign and what he intends to do. Let's bring in our panel, Michael Kroger and Bruce Hawker, with us this afternoon. Michael, first to you. I know you've had kind things to say about Paul Howes in the past. Do you think he's making the right call in moving on after 7 years at the AWU?
Well, I suppose that's a matter for him, but I think it's good news for the Liberal Party that he's going. He's clearly been an influential voice within the Labor movement, probably a voice of reason, and the fact that he's going means that he'll be replaced by someone less articulate and less relevant and less powerful. So I suppose from our point of view, that's a good thing. But he's been in the union movement for a long, long time, and I think in this day and age, if people stay in either a staffing job or in the union movement for the entirety of their working life, before they go into Parliament, if he does, it's better that they have some experience out in the real world. So if that's what he's intending to do, that's a good thing.
You do believe this is a significant loss. I mean, nothing against Dave Oliver, Jed Carney, Tony Sheldon and others, but Paul Howes is a pretty powerful advocate when he picks up an issue, gets the bit between his teeth.
Sure. Look, I mean, there are two types of union leaders in this or three types. The third type are those that are irrelevant. The second type are those that are still fighting the Cold War from the 1970s, and that's all the people you mentioned. And then there's the first type, which are people like Howes, who are in the Keating-Hawke mould of reform, and they understand the world changes, the economy changes, working terms and conditions change, the employment sector changes, and you have to move with the times. And Howes is one of those modern Labor leaders in the Keating tradition, whereas the others you mentioned are still stuck in this sort of 1970s role of a trade union leader fighting the Cold War, and that's what we're left with. So, it's easy to argue against those people because they're not part of the modern economy, they're not part of the modern debate.
Bruce Hawker, you've been on the opposite side of Paul Howes, particularly with the Rudd-Gillard divide over the last 6 years or whatever, however long that lasted. But how do you see his contribution, and do you agree that his loss will be keenly felt?
Yeah, I think Paul Howes is a very intelligent union leader and a very articulate one. Obviously, sometimes I've disagreed with him on a number of issues, including his role in the Rudd removal, but that's all in the past now. The thing that I thought was, and I hope continues to be attractive about him, is that he is prepared to come up and throw some big ideas into the political arena, both internally and in the wider context. Now, again, we won't always agree with them, and even though I thought that the idea that he came up with about the Accord-style compact between unions and business was a great idea in the Hawke government, when Hawke was very much behind that. I didn't think it was really ever going to be particularly valuable when you had a government like the Abbott government, which doesn't really want to go down that path of an accord at all. And I also noticed that today, when there's been speculation in the media that he's going to be saying a few things about the significance of the union movement and its institutional role within the Labor Party, and there's speculation in the Sydney Morning Herald anyway that he's been saying for some time that there should be a split between the union movement and the Labor Party, both for the sake of unions and for the sake of the Labor Party. Now, I think if he continues to articulate that argument, that will be a good thing, because, as you know, I agree with that wholeheartedly. It's something I've been pushing for some time. And it's those big ideas that Paul comes up with from time to time, which I think are very welcome, because so many people in politics these days are rewarded not for coming out with ideas, but for following, for their loyalty rather than for their ability to lead and to sometimes, throw some really difficult issues into the arena. And I think that's something for which he'll be missed.
Now, look, I don't want to talk about Paul Howes all afternoon, but Michael Kroger, this question that's always surrounded him, when will he enter Parliament? Will he enter Parliament? How far will he go? What's your own view on what he should do here? If you were advising him, would you say lay low for a few years or a year or even longer? What do you reckon?
Well, I'm not his advisor, obviously. Well, generically talking, of someone in his position, I think he should go and do something in the private sector, something in academia, maybe something overseas, to gain a broader experience. And it's the same on the Liberal side. People who have just been staffers, and John Howard made this point last year, people have just been staffers and haven't worked seriously outside the confines of a guaranteed salary on a minister or an MP staff, aren't as effective as MPs, generally speaking, as those that have had outside experience. So if he gets some outside experience, I think that's going to be very good for him. Would he be a good Labor Member of Parliament? Yeah, of course he would be. You don't need to be Einstein to know that. I don't think Shorten can win an election. I don't think someone that stabbed 2 Prime Ministers will ever be trusted by the electorate. I can't see anyone in the Parliamentary Labor Party at the minute who can win an election. And Howes is perhaps someone who might, but that's many, many years away because he's obviously not in the House. So, he is one potential Labor leader, but many years down the track.
All right, look, let's move on. I want to talk about South Australia because finally we have an outcome. Jeff Brock, one of the independents, has decided to back Labor in to serve for another 4 years. I mean, they're going to rack up 16 years. Bruce Hawker is someone who was there, helping Labor in winning those early elections. I'm sure you're happy to see this outcome. But what do you think's in store for this independent, Jeff Brock, particularly looking at what happened to Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, the sort of flack they copped?
Well, it's tough being an independent supporting a government of any persuasion, particularly a government which isn't in its first term. I think you can get a lot of largesse from the electorate when you're in the first term of a government, and there were plenty of governments in recent years around the country which have depended on independents to govern. Peter Beattie, Mike Rand, Jeff Gallop come to mind immediately, and they went on to have successful long-term administrations, but that was in the early days. This is in an advanced stage in the life of the government. I think if he basically keeps his head down and doesn't demand too much of them, then life will go on pretty reasonably well for him. But if he throws himself into the political agenda all the time, demands things from the government, and then and then is seen to get them, and it looks like the tail's wagging the dog, then that's a very bad place, not only for him but for the Weatherall government. So that's how I would see it.
What about this argument that Labor faced federally, but it seems to have even more potency in South Australia, given the size of the Liberals' vote there, that they did win the primary vote overwhelmingly and the two-party vote very comfortably as well, by more than 52%. Is there a illegitimacy about Labor being in government?
Well, you've got to win enough seats to form a government. We don't have a presidential style election where it's 50 plus 1%. Otherwise, John Howard wouldn't have won the election in 1998. Politics throws up these results. What it shows is that Labor campaigned extremely well, yet again, in the seats which it had to hold on to. And the Liberals failed in that task. Now, you can spin it any way you like, but at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to, that Labor won the seats they had to win. And they, and this happened 4 years ago. So Alexander Downer and the team in South Australia had 4 years to really look at what happened in 2010 and go about changing their approach. But they don't seem to have done that. And now, they're going to pay a price. The other thing
let me ask Michael Kroger then, because I know you'll have some pretty strong thoughts there on the legitimacy or otherwise of this. It is the system we have in place. It's the electoral system in South Australia. This is the result it's produced.
Well, David, this electoral system it operates in breach of the South Australian law. I mean, the Commissioner is responsible under the Act for basically ensuring, they've got it in legislation, that if you get a majority of the votes, you should be in a position to form government. And this keeps happening in South Australia, election after election. The only mistake the Liberal Party's made is not to take legal action against the Commissioner, which they should have done, to stop the Commissioner producing boundaries in breach of the law. Now, look at it this way. Tony Abbott got 45...
Are you saying they should have done this when the boundaries were drawn up after the last election back in 2010?
Yeah, I think they should have, because they need 54% of the vote to win government, and that is outrageous in a democracy.
Isn't it a bit late to be... Yeah, but isn't it a bit late then to be, saying it was illegal now? I mean, if there was a point to be made and a challenge to be mounted in the courts, surely 4 years ago was the time to do that.
That's what should have happened. That's what should have happened. But look at it this way. I mean, to evidence the point, Tony Abbott got 45.5%, 45.5% of the primary vote and won in a landslide. Stephen Marshall got 45.1% and lost. I mean, that is absolutely preposterous. And this nonsense I keep reading in the paper that, oh, the South Australian division didn't campaign well enough, or Bruce's nonsense points that either you didn't win the votes in the marginal seats. How could the South Australian Liberal Party have done any better? They've got almost 53% of the two-party preferred vote and lost. I mean, if Tony Abbott did a bit better federally than they did in South Australia, he got 53.5% of the two-party preferred vote. He got about a percent better, but not much better. He won 90 seats to 55. The mob in South Australia got 22 and lost.
You know, the Liberals were hoping for a much better result in those marginal urban seats in Adelaide than where they ended up.
Yeah, but David, they got 52.6% of the two-party preferred vote. It's very easy to say, oh, they should have done better. What, they needed to get 54% to win? That's fair? If they got 54%, they would have won those seats, of course. But you can't have a system like that. I mean, the South Australian Liberal Party did a great job. Stephen Marshall did a great job, and I repudiate any criticism of them. God, this has now happened, I think, in 6 of the last 7 elections in South Australia. There is fundamentally something rotten with the South Australian state electoral system, and Pine is absolutely right. This is an illegitimate government, particularly when this independent has gone with Labor, and Labor got 11% of the primary vote in his seat. My God.
I guess the point here is that, you know, in seats like Light and Mawson, the Liberal Party didn't need 54% of the vote. They needed 50 plus 1, and they didn't get it. And there's no amount of spinning that you can do that's going to get around that problem. They didn't win the votes in the seats that counted. They knew what seats they had to win in, and they didn't put in the hard yards. And if you don't do that, then there's a fair chance you're not going to win the election. So, you know, that's just the way it cuts. They have a redistribution in South Australia after every election, as far as I know, and it's open to both the parties to go out and make all the submissions under the sun that they want about it, and they do redistribute the seats. But as the Commission pointed out after the 2010 elections, they can't guarantee that that's going to give them give a result to a political party, because they still have to get the decent candidates in there. They have to have the proper policies, have to show they're hungry for government, and don't think that they're just going to walk in. That's what you've got to do in politics.
Right,
Michael knows that as well as I do.
We got to take a break. Do stay with us, Bruce Hawker and Michael Kroger. We'll continue our discussion right after this. Welcome this afternoon to Michael Kroger and Bruce Hawker. I want to turn to the Prime Minister's visit over the weekend to Papua New Guinea. He was there to focus on a range of things. Obviously, Manus Island and offshore processing was very much in focus. And we heard some interesting remarks from the PNG Prime Minister, Peter O'Neill. Of course, the original deal that Kevin Rudd struck was meant to see all asylum seekers sent to Manus Island, processed, those found to be refugees, all resettled there. But the PNG Prime Minister O'Neill is now saying he doesn't want all of the asylum seekers found to be refugees resettled there. He wants other Pacific nations to shoulder some of this burden as well. Now, the Prime Minister was asked, Tony Abbott that is Australia talking to other Pacific nations? He said he didn't want to imperil any negotiations that might be underway. But listen to this remark today from the Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison. He makes it pretty clear, or very clear, that none of the asylum seekers will be taken back here to Australia. And the expectation is that most, if not all of them, will stay in PNG.
No one's coming back here to Australia. The agreement with Papua New Guinea, I think, is very clear in their undertakings to resettle people in Papua New Guinea. And if there are any other nations that are prepared to get involved with that, then those opportunities will be pursued. But the only place of the people there at the moment, and I would think into the future, are going to be, if they're found to be refugees, is in Papua New Guinea. And if they're found not to be refugees, well, they'll stay in detention or they'll go home.
Well, that's not good enough for the opposition. I did speak to Richard Marles, the Shadow Immigration Minister, and we'll play more of that interview in our next hour. But I just want to show you a little of what he had to say. Pretty strong language indeed about what's now happening with this policy.
Prime Minister has gone to PNG over the weekend. He's come back with far more questions than he has answers. If that is right, well, then the regional resettlement arrangement is unravelling around the Prime Minister.
Now, it is 95 days since a boat made it to Australia, but Michael Kroger, I suppose the the fear here is that if this message gets out that somehow you might not end up staying in Papua New Guinea, well, does that put the sugar back on the table?
Well, I thought, David, that Kevin Rudd had a deal with Prime Minister O'Neill over this. I remember hearing many Labor spokesmen and women during and since the election saying that any credit for stopping the boats or partially stopping the boats was due to Kevin Rudd because he had this agreement with Prime Minister O'Neill. Well, like all things Kevin Rudd, it was half-baked, it seems now, because the Papua Guinean Prime Minister is now hedging his bets in relation to that. So if there was any doubt about there being resettlement in Australia, it might put some sugar back on the table, but the Minister has made it very clear that that is not going to happen and won't happen under any circumstances. So you hope that it won't have that effect, but in the end you have to go back to the original deal between Kevin Rudd and Prime Minister O'Neill, and if it's watertight, it's watertight. If we've got an agreement with them, we've got an agreement with them.
Yeah, Bruce Hawker, you were of course there working alongside Kevin Rudd when this deal was put in place. It did sound good at the time, but was it inevitable there would be stresses and strains on this, that Papua New Guinea, when it came to this particular point of resettling, taking forever those who are found to be refugees, that was going to be a sticking point?
Well, I think this is one of these things where clearly, the local politics is going to play a significant role, and he's probably responding to things that have been happening there in recent times. But there was never ever any suggestion that any refugees that went to Manus Island would end up in Australia, full stop. End of story. That was always quite clear, that if you tried to get to Australia by boat, then you were going to be taken to Manus Island, and you would never get to Australia. That was absolutely clear. I don't think it was. I think there was always open to discussion, though, about further resettlement from Manus Island into other islands. Now, I'm not absolutely 100% certain about that. That's my recollection of it all. And I don't think that's putting sugar on the table. I think it's just recognising that if you're going to go down this path, then there might be other Pacific nations who are prepared to play a role as well. I don't see anything in any of that which detracts from anything that the previous government did and put in place to deal with this terrible problem of people drowning on boats coming to Australia.
But you do, Bruce, you do have, obviously, as you point to there, political differences within PNG over this. The opposition doesn't much like that Manus Island centre, and we know the tensions that were on show last month when that riot took place at the centre itself. I suppose if Peter O'Neill is now, the Prime Minister is now sending signals that he too doesn't want them all resettled there, the question is, where do they go? And we're not talking about different islands in PNG. If the whole country won't take them all, where do they go?
Yeah, well, I don't know, other than that if there are other countries which are prepared to take some of the spillover from Papua New Guinea, then that's fine, that's fair. But the clear intent of the PNG solution was to make sure that people didn't see it as an opportunity, and people smugglers didn't see it as an opportunity to get people to get onto those terrible leaky boats and try to get to Australia with a very high risk that they were going to die on the way. That, I think, was absolutely beyond doubt, and I don't think we should ever resile from anything that we did in that regard, and nor should we, should any government be looking to change that arrangement. I don't think the present government's going to, that's for sure.
No, well, Michael Kroger, it's long been one of these policy areas that's just so difficult to solve. No one, I think, disputes the fact that we want to see boats stopped and people dying at sea trying to get here on some of these dangerous journeys. But, we are starting to see more and more scrutiny of the situation at Manus Island, the conditions there. No doubt it's appalling for those who are having to endure it. At what point do you think this will become a pressure point politically for the Abbott government, those conditions?
No, I don't think it will be, because everyone is, in good faith, is doing the best they possibly can, David, to look after people who have escaped terrible conditions but are not coming to Australia. Now look, I never heard, by the way, Kevin Rudd say it was resettlement in New Guinea or another Asian nation still to be negotiated. I never heard him say that. He said before the election there was an agreement with the New Guinea government that they would go to New Guinea. They would be resettled in New Guinea. That was the agreement he announced. Now, he either had that agreement with Prime Minister O'Neill or he didn't. So one party or the other is trying to weasel out of this agreement. And if we have the agreement that Kevin Rudd told the electorate he had, then Prime Minister O'Neill needs to stick to the agreement. And if it wasn't that agreement, then Kevin Rudd should have said before the election, some will be going to New Guinea and some will be going to other places, but we don't know where yet. It can't be both. But, you know, this is the problem for Labor, that now they concentrate on the big issue, which they say is the conditions on Manus Island. Yes, it's an issue, but it is a minuscule issue compared to the major issue, which is this. In the last 90-odd days, no one has drowned at sea under Scott Morrison and Tony Abbott's policy. And to repeat for the millionth time, if Kevin Rudd had had the decency to say in 2008, John Howard got it right, we're continuing with his policy, 1,200 people would not have drowned and lost their lives, David. That is the truth of the matter.
I just made this point, David. There's a new government in Canberra now. They can't hide behind anything that Rudd did. They've got to make their own decisions and their own negotiations with the Papua New Guinea government. There's no point in trying to pass that back to Rudd or anybody else. This is their responsibility to sort out.
Yeah, but Bruce, the agreement of the Australian government with New Guinea survives the election. Tony Abbott can't say, oh, because there's a new government here, we're not bound by Kevin Rudd's agreement.
I don't think they've got any intention. It's an agreement with a sovereign power. I don't think they've got any intention of trying to renegotiate anything. But I'm just making the point that you just can't go around saying that this is all the fault of Labor if there is a new government in power who are able to renegotiate anything they like.
A lot of this hinges on the deal that Kevin Rudd did with Peter O'Neill, a crucial deal, and I'm just being told here by a source that agreement specifically did allow for resettlements in countries other than Australia. That it wasn't just the claim that it was just PNG was not backed up by the agreement.
Yeah.
And
that was in clause 5
of the agreement signed by. What were the other countries, David?
As I said,
David, the source you've got, what were the other countries?
Well, no other countries have agreed to take them, either then or now. And
but the option was open. That's the point. The option was open. The point I just made 5 minutes ago.
OK, we got to go. Bruce Hawker, Michael Kroger, good to talk to both of you. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.